Hello, welcome to Games as Digital Literature, panel by Voiceworks Online. I'd like to acknowledge first that this event is broadcast from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. We also pay our respects to the traditional custodians of all the lands from which our readers are presenting in this broadcast. We acknowledge the lands on which this broadcast reaches and acknowledge First Nations people as the traditional custodians of this country, whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history. We pay respect to the elders of these communities, past and present, and extend that to emerging community leaders. We recognize that sovereignty was never ceded and that colonization is an ongoing process. It was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Rory Green. I'm broadcasting from Gadigal land today. I'm an online editor for Voiceworks and also a facilitator for Toolkit's Digital Storytelling, which is an online learning program run by Express Media for young writers and artists around Australia. For those who don't know, Voiceworks is a national literary journal that features exciting new writing and art by young Australians. Our purpose is to create a space for people under 25 to develop their creative and editorial skills and to publish and be paid for their fiction, non-fiction, poetry, art, and comics. Each selected piece goes through a collaborative editing process, and we provide individualized feedback for all unsuccessful submissions. Our online publishing arm, Voiceworks Online, launched in 2018 and aims to publish digitally specific literary work. Joining me for this panel, we have Carly Stone. Carly Stone is a nonfiction writer using experimental forms to challenge distinctions: subject-object, body-environment, cockroach-god. Their essays have appeared in Voiceworks, The Lifted Brow, and on Lifted Brow's Experimental Nonfiction Prize shortlist. Carly is also the founding director of Talkbox, a spoken word night for emerging writers in Melbourne. They study philosophy and literature at the University of Melbourne, but they don't really know who Hegel is and now worry that they're in too deep to ask. We also have Lujayn Hourani. Lujayn is a writer, editor, and arts worker based in Naarm. Their work has appeared in Overland, Meanjin, The Lifted Brow, Going Down Swinging, and Voiceworks, among others. And last but not least, we have Cecile Richard. Cecile Richard is a graphic designer, illustrator, zine maker, and game designer living in Melbourne. Their personal work often revolves around memory, connection, and belonging. They like birds and AFL. I thought I'd also maybe just quickly read the sort of blurb that we have for this panel. Games as digital literature. Games and literature share a common thread. Both involve telling stories with heart and imagination. So how can these two creative communities support one another? Voiceworks Online editors, game designers, and writers working at the cutting edge of the Australian literary community, I guess that's us, discuss their experiences using games to tell stories and share how literary approaches to narrative could benefit game makers. That's my spiel done. Hi, everyone.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm real pumped to get into like the deep theory, the deep lore around games and lit, but I thought might start with something sort of more personal and ask like, what are some of your favorite stories in games? Have you all grown up playing games and have memories associated with stories and games?
I remember the first game I ever played was I don't know if you know like Endless Katamari. It's that game where you're like this really little prince in space and you're just kind of like rolling around a bunch of objects that you find like miscellaneously in supermarkets and farms and that kind of thing. And that was like the first time I'd ever played like a digital game properly. I was super young. It was on my brother's Xbox or whatever. And I remember him being like, Carly, this is about consumerism and capitalism. And I was like, yeah, that's cool. It blew my mind. I actually don't think I played it since I was like 10 years old or something like that. Or maybe that's a bit
You should
young.
re-engage and be like, now I get it. It's about consumerism.
I really want to struggle with that. It's been just reappearing in dreams during isolation because I can't find it anywhere anymore. But yeah, maybe someday I'll track it down. But that's definitely like what sort of mapped out my interest in gaming from the start.
Nice. Lujayn, what about you?
If we're going with like the first and formative game, I'm gonna say, I don't really know how to describe them, but it was like, you know, those consoles that aren't branded to anywhere specific, and then they're like 5-in-1 games, and they've got like a duck shooting game, and they've got like really rough. Yeah. But I remember saving up with my cousins and buying one communally, and we had it at my grandma's house.
So sick.
And that's what we'd play, and it was like there was no storyline. It was not about anything. It was not about consumerism. It was just like no thoughts, and I loved it. I loved just like doing something with my hands and being like, I'm following this, and it is easy.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I like that both of those kind of stories are like about games where the story is sort of like subtexty, I guess. Like, because my thought in this was like the opposite direction, and thinking about growing up with the first Kingdom Hearts game, which has this very like melodramatic, overcomplicated story with like Final Fantasy characters and Mickey Mouse, and like everybody has like 3 versions of themselves, and like I feel like I love that game so much, and I feel like the story links with like you know, like soap operas and sort of like myths that like I was also really into as like a child. You know, when you like Egyptology, or like, you know, you get really into like some ancient, like, you know, ancient Greece or whatever. So like a really different end. Cecile, what about you?
Okay, so the first game that I ever played was, I'm pretty sure it was this Hamtaro game that never came out anywhere else than Japan. And so like when I was a kid, like the only way that we could get video games in the house was if like my mom was like, oh, you can only get video games if they're like in Japanese, because that will help you learn better to read the language. And like the first game that I ever got was this Hamtaro game where it's kind of like this. So like this hamster is your friend, and like every day you talk to him and he tells you about life, and he's like, oh, today's weather is, you know, your mental weather is like this, so, you know, take care of yourself. And like I feel like it's like a very good precursor to like a whole lot of like self-care games that like kind of exist now, and like back when it was like not a thing at all. And like I really like that game, but like back then I didn't really understand it because I couldn't read as well that I could now, obviously. So like I was like, I don't know what he's saying. And now, and like much later when I was in my teens, I like started playing it again, and it actually really helped me somehow like just kind of feel better about being social and like having crushes and stuff, because Hamtaro would say, you know, don't worry, like if something doesn't go right, then, you know, it's fine, you know, like just being very comforting. This little like digital fake hamster would be very nice to me.
It's so
that was really
you
good.
mentioned Hamtaro, because I feel like I had a very specific experience with that little hamster as well, where my dad only let us watch Arabic cartoons and play Arabic games. And Hamtaro was always on TV, and I remember my cousins had the video game, but it was in Arabic.
Hell yeah, that's so cool. Honestly though, like the games after like this one that are more like video gamey, like they're so good. Like they're actually really good, and I'm like, I love them. Everyone should play them.
I like you talking about this Hamtaro game being like sort of proto self-care, Cecile, because I was playing a whole bunch of your games today, and seeing that kind of ideas of care throughout both like Novena and Endless Scroll. And I guess it kind of, I wanted to talk about Novena because it won Freeplay's Micro Game Award last year. And also you refer to it as a poem on the Itch store. And I think is a nice like entry point into this like space that we're in today, which is kind of like games and stories and literature, and why we refer to these things as such, and whether that's like a good thing or what that does. Can you talk a bit about your kind of connections between like games and literature? Like, why did you call Navina a poem?
I think it was like, because like I started like working on the game by writing the text first. Like that was the first thing that, you know, came out. And it was like, okay, well, now I've got this thing. What am I going to do with it? And it's like, well, I'm going to make a game. And that was kind of like the genesis of that was essentially like me writing this poem, like contextless. And well, not contextless. I was like definitely like thinking, well, there's this like game jam going on with Bitsy, and the, you know, like the theme was ocean. I was like, okay, I can write something about ocean and see where that goes. And then I wrote that. It kind of like was very, it was it was kind of like divine intervention. Like when that when that happened, I was like, oh well, I'm gonna write all these things, and then it sounded pretty good, and I edited it a little bit, and then it was good, and I was like, okay, this is it. And like the thing is that on itch you can like change the like noun that is like on, you know, like when you click play something, you can be like, instead of saying play game, you can say play poem, you know. And I was like, this is cool. Like that was really kind of like my reasoning was like, oh, this is funny, let's do poem, you know. Like it was a very like kind of natural thing to do for me for that game.
So when you were writing the piece, were you like, I'm writing this thing that I'm then going to turn into a Bitsy game, or like did you know from the get-go you wanted to make a game with it, or was there a point where you were like, maybe I'll publish this, like, you know, as a poem?
Yeah, actually, like I kind of went through the motions. So like basically this idea, like the core concept was like something that was kind of like in my head for a long time. Like even before I wrote the thing, I was like, oh well, I think I talked about this in my parallels speech a few years back. But like essentially, like I had this idea, and not specifically about like, it wasn't that form, but like I was like, oh, I want to make something about like being like about what it's like to be a person whose friends, you know, rely on them, but you don't feel like you can rely on anyone else. Like that was kind of like my idea. Like I was like, how do I get this out basically? And I tried making like a comic about it, and it was like, nah, I don't like it. I tried, you know, like to do all these other things, like try to express it in other ways, and really like the game is what stuck. And yeah, like, so it's funny because it didn't start as like, I want to make a game about this, but rather like a progression of things that happened to make a game. Like I don't know if that makes sense.
I get you.
Yeah. I think like I think I lost the thing that I was trying to say. Yeah, sorry.
I'll just throw over to Kyle and Lujayn, because the idea of like Navina as a game being like a sort of progression from like through different forms to find something that fit best. I'm interested to hear Kyle and Lujayn about The Results Will Shock You, which is, I don't know if you want to give a bit of an intro to it, but it's like a awesome collaboration that the two of you worked on.
Yeah, I guess we put it together around this time last year. We came up with a concept, which was to have like these, it was pretty ambitious to start with. We were going to have these 3 like conversational AIs that could kind of like respond to the things that you said to them and develop these personalities based on the conversations that you had. So we'd have these 3 different AIs where one would be like receiving really nice compliments all the time. Like one would just be having these really horrible, grim conversations about, I don't know, sad, horrible things. And then just one control one that we just talk about plant facts too.
Yeah.
And this was based on this like phony experiment that I found on Mythbusters at some point, which is like where they had these 3 plants and they said nice things to plant 1, mean things to plant 2, and then the second plant wilted, and Mythbusters were like, oh my god, the plant's really sad, you made the plant sad, this is why you don't bully people or whatever. And we're kind of going to do like a digital piece that was based on that, and then it kind of just turned into a significantly smaller project, and then a piece that we published in, I think, August last year.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I feel like we went in the complete opposite trajectory to you, Cecile, where we came up with the game first, and we were like, once this game is out there and we've collected the data, then we're actually going to write a piece about it. I feel like we sat with that data for months before we actually wrote and turned it into a piece of literature. But yeah, the function was there for so long, and we knew exactly how we wanted it to look and we wanted it to do, and then everything else came later.
Yeah, it's interesting you talking about like having this function and then seeing like what sorts of things come out of that to then inform like your story, I guess, because a lot of what I do at the moment with like computer generated poems and with tracery is like usually taking text that I've written in like draft forms or whatnot and combining it with other random sources of text, and then like feeding that into a generator and seeing what comes out and taking the things I like from that. So like there might often start with like a theme, I guess, in the sense that like the words that I'm putting in have like a particular sort of topic around them. So like Futurity Blues is this poem that I made that was very like, I don't know, kind of apocalyptic. And the sort of stuff that I was putting in there was kind of informed by that. But then the stuff that came out at certain points was quite like, I don't know, almost a bit like domestic and a bit banal in a way that really threw me, but I really liked. And then that output from the computer kind of became a stronger part of the piece. And having that like, yeah, that form change because of the tool that I was using. Which to me, I think it's like a kind of play. It's always kind of like working with the computer in ways that like I don't know what it's going to do 100%, which is I think where the like, I don't know, the fun is. How I'm interested actually in the with the results will shock you, the way you wrote up the piece afterwards, like and also the way, because I was reading it today and there's kind of a mixture of sort of chat conversations and then also prose pieces parts. How does that sort of how did that collaboration work with the two of you? Like yeah, how'd you go about writing the stuff up afterwards?
Well, I kept a log, and I like kept it from Carly at the beginning so that they wouldn't catch on to the fact that I was like logging what we were saying to each other, and they wouldn't adapt what they were saying to me. But I was like, everything from this point on, since we'd like conceptualized it, everything from this point on is material.
Speaking of guinea pigs.
So even though we didn't actually write it until much later, I was like accumulating all this data outside of the game. Our friendship was an experiment. Yeah. I
like this moment where the both of you like look at each other and you're like, the game has begun. Like, let's go to our separate corners. Like, start our logs. No talking to one another.
God, I need to catch up, don't I? Yeah, I feel like I think I definitely took a slightly more slapdash approach, much less measured. But yeah, I think you, Lujayn, had so much all this like intel and data, and we'd collected all this weird intel and data from people who'd been at our like sort of launch event communicating with these fake plants and giving them all this information. So we had like all these big spreadsheets with just random bits of sentiment were kind of like really arbitrarily going through and being like, oh, this person's talking about compost, like that seems mean to apply a negative one, and doing really similar arbitrary things with obviously like the things that Lujayn had kept track of, and then kind of collating it into this very, very pseudo-scientific piece that was, I feel like we wrote a lot of it just over a couple of days. It was this real mad scientist free association sort of situation.
And it's interesting too, because when you look at the launch event, it was at a bar, and it started at like 7 o'clock and it went until like 11. And the data that we have of people interacting with our bots have timestamps. And so you can see like as the night goes on and as it gets later, people are drinking more, and then it becomes like more chaotic. And that was our process of writing too, where we were so calculated at the beginning. And then it just spiraled in the same way that all these people did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like when you're like, my experiences with making things that are digital, where there's like multiple components, is like you can have this like, yes, this is the boundaries of where I'm going to be working. And then like so quickly just like, and you're like, okay, now like if this like gets put together in a way that doesn't like, where like it actually runs, it doesn't break. I guess that's one advantage of maybe having the output being this like print document, is that it won't break at runtime. But like, yeah, pretty hectic. Cecile, I wanted to ask you about sort of working, because I guess Carly and Lujayn have kind of worked together on this piece, and in a way that is quite like playful, and I consider a lot of my stuff also like a playful collaboration, except it's with a computer bot, maybe a bit friendless. I wanted to ask you, Cecile, about like games or stories that you've worked on with other people. I guess Endless Scroll is one example that we could talk about, but is there any others that you wanted to sort of mention?
So like right after like Novena, I have worked on like 2 other games with my partner Andy, and that was fun. Like I think it's like a different, like I take a different role in that collaboration, because like Andy does the programming and I do the art. When I'm working on my own, usually I'm the one making everything, and and so like it's definitely like a different kind of collaborate, like of just like creative process, where like you can kind of like, it's kind of easier to like bounce things off each other and like hold each other accountable kind of like for getting the thing done, essentially. Where like when I'm on my own, I would be more like inclined to procrastinate. Like this is kind of like, maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but yeah, I tend to do that. So I think it's like, I don't know, I just like definitely enjoy collaborating with people more. And I think Endless Scroll is kind of like a good illustration of that, where like, because you were kind of like involved with the editing process, I kind of felt like, and that was like in a time where I was feeling a little bit more self-conscious about my own writing, and I was feeling a little bit unsure about like how to get my like point across, like on, like in writing and stuff, and like having your presence like be there, like it just felt like a lot more comforting, and like, oh, like if something's not as good, there's always someone who can tell me that. And like I think that's a very important thing, and that I really value a lot. And which is what, like now like whenever I make something, like with my newest game as well, like I would just like ask like a friend or whatever, like to read over my script and be like, hey, what do you think? Like, honestly, what do you think? And like they'd be like, oh yeah, you should change this, or like, like maybe you can formulate this better, like never like outright like this is not good, right? But like it's like helpful in, you know, like good feedback essentially. And I'm blessed with like good people around me that who I can just ask, and that's good.
Yeah, I should flag, I guess, for listeners, like the context that Endless Scroll, which is nominated for some Freeplay awards again this year, which is really cool, was originally published on Voiceworks Online, the site where Carly and I are editors, and it was the first game that we've published at Voiceworks, and the first time I've edited a game, so to speak. I don't know, it's hard this is where like the boundaries for me of like games and lit sort of fall apart, because you know, when I say edit game, I think of like a whole bunch of other parts where like, I don't know, maybe I get feedback on, but I can't think of it as like, yes, I was editor on visuals or audio, you know what I mean? But like, I guess what I wanted to ask is how do you see the kind of like differences between like stories that you've worked on or games you've worked on your own, like with Navina, versus like that editorial process with Voiceworks, particularly in terms of like the development of the story?
I think the difference lies in, it's interesting because like the two are very like related in a way. Like so like Novena I wrote in pretty much one sitting, and I edited it in one sitting. And then it was like most of the time I spent making the game, as in like just programming, making the app, blah blah blah, all that stuff. Like that took the most time. And then by the time I was working on Endless Scroll, I was a lot more like aware of like writing. Like I was a lot more aware of like people that would play my game, whereas like Novena was my first game, so I didn't really care for that, honestly. Like I mean, it's not that I didn't care, but like I didn't really realize that there was an audience, or like, you know, like I don't know, it's just like it was like a completely different context, and that is the kind of like that is where like the difference lies. And like, and because now I put a lot more attention on the writing with an editorial process, etc., like it turns out that writing takes about as much time as making the game now. Like it's, I mean, it's part of making the game, but like you know, it's like those are two slightly different like things that, you know, end up being put together. And yeah, like so now it's like a lot more like, well, I'm writing this, and then I'm doing the art, and then I'm programming, and it's like, it's interesting to see that. And maybe it's also because like the stuff that I'm making now is more complex in sort of narrative, but yeah, I feel like those are the differences.
I can remember last year kind of one of the things that was new for me and a bit tricky was talking about the text and then the game as these sort of like separate parts, but also knowing that they were so closely like linked, like reading through parts of the script and then being like, I'm not sure about this, but also like can be really dependent on what, like, how are you going to visualize this? And remember seeing like a couple of rough panels for certain things that was enough to kind of be like, yes, okay, like this is like definitely, you know, makes sense. But to see kind of, I remember the sort of first version that went, I think almost up to the end sort of sequence, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is like taken on a whole other dimension. And I think that's kind of been tricky as an editor for Voiceworks Online for pieces where there are like text and image, or like, you know, these multimodal sort of stories. And I know Carly's, you've also edited multimodal stuff on Voiceworks Online, various digital stories. how have you found that process? Look, also Lujayn, you have you edited like digital? You edited digital stories with the Brow, right?
Yeah. Very briefly, but yes.
How have you also come across that, like, yes, the text, like this is like, you know, I'm used to working with words and being like, yes, this is going along well, and then also having this whole other sort of medium to bring into the editorial process. Like, have you found that?
Yeah, I think I found it really challenging. I still feel very new to it. But it is such an interesting space, right? Because at Voiceworks and when you were at the Brow as well, we were kind of like digital editors were just sort of like the same kind of thing as like poetry editors or nonfiction editors. But when you're doing digital editing, it feels very, very different. Like it's a very different process. You're kind of like working with a lot of different, like talking about multimodal stuff, you're working with like sometimes sound and images and animation and all these kinds of things while you're also trying to like edit the real minutiae of like a piece, like the syntax and like the writing stuff, all the nitty gritty. So I think that I haven't quite found a method yet. I think because I'm feeling quite new, it's very touch and go, but it's almost like you're doing these parallel editing processes. Yeah. It's like you're kind of, there are these different streams of like really big picture experiential stuff. And then there's like the really minute scheme of like editing the piece and just like working with the writing itself. So I think it can feel, because it's such a new area as well, digital literature like is still really amorphous and undefined. Like I think there's not really like a set way to go about that process. But it's quite exciting being at the very start of it and watching it evolve and meeting with other people and figuring out new methods of editing.
We're definitely at the start of DigiLit, which is exciting, but it also can be really frustrating. I feel like at the Brow, one thing that I kept coming up against was the fact that like a piece could, from a literary perspective, be doing these incredible things, and then our capacity in terms of what we could actually do with the digital elements to accompany it were really limited. And so we ended up having to make a lot of compromises in terms of like what would go with the piece. And it would be literature up front and then digi stuff on the side, as opposed to really having like marrying the two and having them work side by side. I feel like it's really tricky to find that balance. And from like a foundational point of view, I don't know that a lot of the journals that I've encountered just like don't have that infrastructure in place. The Brow was one of them that I really struggled with. And yeah, you're only as good as your back end. and that was just like really annoying for me.
But yeah, I can relate really hard to a lot of this stuff. And like when you talk about like the compromises, I guess, between like the writing and then the sort of like realization of it as a like digital piece. I feel like I haven't had too many moments at Voiceworks where I've really had to be like, there's no way I can do this. But also I have like spent a lot of time like doing independent sort of research and trying to Google how to do things so that I can like try and get as close to what the kind of writer sort of pitches, I guess, is, or like their kind of vision. It's probably not an ideal editorial position to be doing that sort of like technical research. But with Lou, you've also like made a few digital pieces like for like EWF and Digital Writers Festival and stuff. How have you gone about those pieces? Do you use like tools to like sort of handle the technical stuff for you, or like I was looking at your piece from Digital Writers Festival with Adalia today, and really loving, because it's like this interactive PDF document, and it's such a like like a simple technology, but you've just used it in this way that I like would never have thought to do. And that's what I love about like digital lit stuff at the moment. Like how do you approach those pieces that you've made that are like digital?
That was a lot of Googling for that piece, actually. I feel like it was when I was still not very familiar with InDesign. I'm like looking back being like, how did I not know how to do such simple things? But even that was a lot of Googling, and I feel like I was leaning, the two of us were both kind of leaning into early or late 90s, early 2000 tech, and like old websites from that era, because it was so forgiving that you could really just like have fun with it. And if it was a bit simple and if it looked a bit glitchy, that was part of the charm. And that was, I think, something that I'm still doing quite a bit, because I feel like I don't know, maybe it's because I see it as like the beginning of DigiLit, so I feel like an attachment to it, even though I was not like growing up in the like Googling things in the late 90s. But I love that aesthetic, and I feel like it works a lot with the fact that we're very much at the beginnings of DigiLit. So I'm like mirroring that in a lot of the stuff that I make.
Okay. It's interesting to hear you say like the beginnings of DigiLit, because like I also feel that, but kind of it feels weird thinking of it that way when like sort of digital lit stuff has been around since, like you were saying, like since the 90s. And actually I've just finished reading this book on electronic literature, which kind of breaks it up into genres of like combinatory poetry and hypertext and interactive poetry. And for each of these sort of genres, the author kind of goes back and finds like an analog sort of and like origin point, where it's like all of these things that we're like, oh wow, this is like a born digital process has actually sort of existed in some form, like, you know, whether it be like the cut up or like there's this wild I can't remember the name of the filmmaker, but was a New Zealand filmmaker in the 30s who would like scratch like the film directly and create these sort of like visual kind of like glitch effects, and you like watch this thing and it's like, this looks like a processing sketch or some sort of like digital like interactive art, but it's all done on film. I don't really know where I was going with that, but I find it interesting that there is this like really long history, but also it kind of doesn't have a trait, like it doesn't it has a very faint trace, I guess. So it that kind of becomes hard when we're doing stuff with Voiceworks Online, that like it feels like there isn't something to look back to for guidance, even though there has been lots of things that have kind of existed. I don't know what I
feel like it's so interesting as well that you're right. Since the inception of the internet, there have been blogs and stories online, but for some reason it took 20 odd years for journals and literary institutions to actually embrace them. Like what was going on in that gap? Was it like a highbrow, lowbrow kind of thing?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's quite interesting to I think I haven't ever really gone back and looked at these really like early forms of digital and electronic literature, and it's interesting how you can trace things back to, say, like the 1930s. You can trace some back pieces of digital literature in like the 90s and like the really early internet, and I'm sure for anyone engaging with this idea of electronic lit in any of these eras, they would have felt like they were at the very, very beginning of something. And I wonder if that's got to be something to do with the nature of digital literature itself, if we're always going to feel like we're at the very beginning of it, because we're occupying this space that's constantly transforming. Like that's probably the one defining characteristic of electronics, is it's always going to be something that's evolving, and every bit of new like evolution requires a new process and a new kind of framework for expressing yourself and for editing. So yeah, I'm wondering if we're always going to feel like we're just getting started.
I feel like with the sort of the nature of like technologies that we use to make games and also digital lit, I think constantly changing is like that you don't really get to have time to document it, or like you neglect to document sort of the how as you are building. And like I've had this with like things that I've kind of, you know, like kind of thrown together with tracery, where I sometimes have to go back and figure out like what I made, because I'm terrible with code documentation. I don't understand how this thing that I made works. And even that extends to like tracery, which like is this fantastic language for sort of generating text. But there are things that it can do that not things that are like workarounds, but actually like built into the sort of JavaScript library that aren't really explained anywhere great. Like, and like the tutorials are sort of split across like GitHub and then the Tracy website, and then like they've just recently started a wiki for people to kind of share their contributions. Cecile, I see you smiling. Is this like an experience with Bitsy as well? Because
yeah, yes and no. No, actually, like honestly, like Bitsy has been, because it's so like it's so recent that like I think people have started a wiki or a repository of stuff, but like most of the information is on the Discord. Like
right.
I'm just thinking, because like, so all the hacks are in one place, and because like it's like I think multiple people makes them, but they're in this one repo, and that's really good. And whenever like someone has a problem with that, they just refer to the Discord and either ask something or like search on it. And like, so it's pretty much just that. I don't really Google stuff, because like Googling Bitsy just doesn't cut it. Like, it's not like you get like all these like unrelated results, so it's not really irrelevant. But like, so like I think like a lot of it is community based. Like a lot of the help that you can get is like me. Like usually I just do that all the time. I'm like, whenever I'm working on something new, usually people can tell I'm working on something when I'm like, hey, can I get help with this one thing? Like, why does this not work? You know, like, and usually that's how people like in the Discord know that I'm working on something. But yeah, like I think like that though, like the whole like experience of like everything, like all this information being in different places is like very common to coding in general, which I'm only a very small, like I have a small amount of knowledge of, but I can tell even in my small knowledge that it's quite difficult. Fortunately with Bitsy it's not like that. It's like it's a lot easier to get information as long as you know, like are in the Discord pretty much, and that's pretty accessible, so that's good.
That story of like Discord reminds me so much of like the process at Voiceworks, where like you know, the editorial committee which edits the magazine is kind of, you know, there's editors for fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and they meet in Melbourne every week and now online to share updates on the pieces that they're editing. And that feels like also like a really common experience to be like, I don't, like, something is off about this piece and I don't know what, like, help me troubleshoot this story. And like Harley, we've had those conversations a lot on Slack as well, like both with the technical stuff and also with the story editing, I guess, or like yeah,
I think probably everything that I've done at Voiceworks so far, I've sent it to you at some stage and being like, Rory, this is really good, but there's just something's off, something's not good about it. And every single time you've been like, I know exactly the answer. It's been amazing. But yeah, that's such a familiar thing, having to just outsource like vibe reading, basically. When you've got your head so far into a digital literature piece with all the different streams and all the different kind of modes. It's so helpful to kind of be able to reach out to your community, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's not just like the online stream, but like sometimes I'll I think I'm in a couple of other editorial streams just out of curiosity. I'm in the poetry one and the general one, and then we'll sometimes just sort of lurk on those channels, even though I'm not involved in the work there. But it's just interesting seeing someone be like, this is what I think of this piece, but there's something missing, or there's, what do I need to focus on now? And seeing the way people kind of respond to a literary work in different ways and make these suggestions is just really, really interesting. I feel like I've learned so much at Voiceworks through lurking, the Slack channels and the email, to see kind of how different people edit in different ways. And Lujayn, have you had that experience as well? Working with other editors on pieces and
I think it's very similar to what Carly was saying, how you really just get stuck into a piece that you almost lose your instinct. You start second guessing why something's not working. And I feel like it carries over. It's not just in digital editing, but it's just generally when I'm really, after the first round of edits, I kind of lose track of what it is that a piece needs, because I'm well, I've already made the first round of changes. Am I now going off instinct, or am I projecting? Am I putting too much of myself into this? And that's why I feel collaborative, or at least in my experience, it's been really helpful to kind of collaborate and just have someone to bounce ideas off of. Even if they're not the ones editing a piece, it's still can I get a second pair of eyes on this and a second opinion?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I really, I feel like there's so much to know about editing. It's an interesting field, because it just feels even with as much experience as you get, there's so many different places a piece can go that require kind of different skill sets. And then I think when you bring in the website, and you've now also got these multimedia elements, it's just it's a bit of a crazy juggle.
Yeah, and I feel it's not just skill set, but it can also just be general schools of knowledge. And there are so many things that one person can write about or tell a story about, and if they're writing about something that you don't have much experience of, it's how are you going to be the best editor you can be? It's always good to check with someone who maybe has a better gauge of the content that you're actually editing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I really value that part of Voiceworks, that, the editorial team is quite large and very collaborative and willing to help each other out and stuff. I wanted to ask about game making and lit communities, because we've talked a little bit about the way the Bitsky Discord and then the Voiceworks EdCom, and I'm interested in where these sort of the practices of these communities sort of mirror each other or overlap. But I have to admit, I'm not maybe the best person to be talking about that, because I haven't spent a huge amount of time in game making communities, apart from in the sort of lurking capacity online. But Cecile, you've kind of been involved at workshops at Bar SK and what I would loosely refer to as the game scene in Melbourne. Is that a fair sort of call?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess I think I am quite involved in that. I mean, still am involved in the community stuff, because I don't know, it feels weird to say I stumbled in it, but I kind of did. But anyway, I mean, I feel like everyone does. But anyway, yeah, I think like I've seen some like push to like build a bridge between like different like art fields, specifically like literary stuff. Like I know that Bonfire Park was a thing. I know that they also like do the thing with the brow, and then like there has been like initiatives, and I feel like there should be more, because I think like those are very like they can definitely like, to me they can only be like very interesting stuff that happens when like these two worlds like collide. And yeah, like I don't know, I just to me I just think that I would like to see more of this, like more of like this weird games that people have to read, like because I feel like so much like, I mean, like I feel like it's like Bitsy in particular, like I think is a good example of like the legacy of like these text adventure games, and like these more like these older, like the older history of games in like the Western world, essentially, like where it's all these kind of abstract things and that people tend to forget about, like yeah, and because they're like things that are like flashier and stuff like now in the 21st century that people won't be really inclined to read, to play a Twine game or a Bitsy game. And I kind of want, what I want is for people to be excited by that. And I'm like,
yeah,
like how do we do that? And like, I guess, well, the future will tell.
I think it's interesting. I want to talk about, you mentioned Twine and Bitsy, and it'd be interesting to talk about these tools that help people make games or game-like things without having to have that technical knowledge. But I also just wanted to recap sort of Bonfire Park for those who didn't know. Was a exhibition and zine series that Alex Bennett has created, pairing game makers in Melbourne, or maybe internationally, I'm not too sure, with writers to sort of make literary pieces inspired by the games, and sort of presenting in these kind of like, I think it was a exhibition at Bar SK, right? And then like an accompanying zine.
Yeah.
Which I think is like a really cool, kind of opportunity for game makers and writers to learn from each other's creative practices and have those kind of feed off one another. I remember talking with Gemma Mahadeo, who worked on a piece for the first version of Bonfire Park, and kind of like her kind of reconceptualization of her writing based on the kind of like game structures in the game that she was reviewing. I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, but anyway, back to Twine and to like these tools that I like. You talked about wanting to get more people involved or excited about this space, and to me, like one of the biggest things is like, you don't have to be good at everything to do something in this space now. Like you can you can make interactive things really simply with tools that do a lot of the technical legwork for you, with Twine and with Bitsy, and there's obviously like so many more. Does anyone want to talk about their experiences with like these tools and like what they enjoy, kind of what they offer you, and also maybe if you feel like there's any like limitations to the tools that you've used? Carly and Lou, you've both worked with Twine before, right?
And it's Cecile, you mentioned earlier that Bitsy is very community-based and you kind of just like ask questions and get them answered. And that's one thing I really like about, like I used Glitch when I was learning to code. And that was really helpful because it was super community-based. And I feel like Twine is very similar, where there aren't any expectations to be great at what you're doing. You're just like, everyone's finding their footing, and that's really nice. That I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong about this, that you're not expected to be a professional. If you don't know something, then it's not going to be embarrassing at all. And I find that with like print writing, that's not always the case. It feels a bit more insular. It feels a bit more top level, whereas digital, what my experience with apps like Twine have been just really inviting.
And I wonder if that's because like print has such a documented like really like naturalized history, and everything that you put in print is like final, and you have to identify with it, and you have to stand behind it, whereas with things like Twine and these casual creators, like they're there to be really flexible, and they're there because like if you make a mistake, you just go into the back end and change something and fix it. And like I think there's so much more, because they're kind of more in the family of games than the family of literature. I think that's the way they're seen, at least. I think there's so much more room for play, and people aren't really as attached, and like they don't really try to keep hold of their own ideas, and like people are really, really generous with their knowledge and their learning and that kind of thing. No one's really withholding information, and there's not really, there's no sense of competition. I think it's like everyone is so earnest and so enthusiastic about sharing knowledge and resources, which is beautiful.
But then I wonder if that lack of rigidity is what demotivates people from or scares people off from actually getting involved, because they're like, I don't know, sometimes boundaries can be nice. You like know exactly what to do, and with something as malleable as DigiLit, it's kind of like, where do I start, where do I stop?
Yeah, having like a sign somewhere that says start here can be really really useful, not just like in games, but I also think about like lit, right? Like the things that I kind of got involved in as a writer, like sort of happened because I had friends who were older and more experienced and knew what was possible to sort of say, hey, you can do that, that's possible. And I don't know, like I really appreciate Voiceworks as a sort of organization for their commitment to young writers, because they do kind of operate quite well as like a sort of, hey, if you want to become a writer, this is or you want to become an editor, this is like a great place to start. And have a really clear sort of, I don't know, the process, I guess, around Voiceworks is also quite clear, like submitting to the magazine, and like every submission gets feedback, whether, it gets accepted into the magazine or not. And I feel like that sort of like process, that the visibility of that process is really encouraging in certain, whereas in other places like, what to make, when to make, where to publish, can be quite overwhelming. Yeah.
I just wanted to bounce back on that notion of like boundaries and like motivation in community-based, like, in the Bitscourt, like we call it, there's like in the Bitsy community there's like monthly Bitsy jams, like game jams, where like there's like a theme that's voted on, and for like a week or two you can work on this like game or whatever, like a game based on a theme, and that's where like that's where it all started for me, where like it's like this one-time thing, and you're like, okay, time to make a game, and then like that's your motivation essentially. It's like, okay, I'm part of this community, and now we are all making this different things based on this one theme, and we'll see like the whole collection at the end, like that sort of thing. Like it's quite simple, but I think it works good, like it works well as like a an initial motivation thing. Like you can take part in like in one game jam and that's it, or like you can, you know, do it every month, so you can do it like whenever the theme kind of speaks to you. And I think that sort of stuff is cool. Like and you know, it really is like, we are really fortunate in the Bitsy community that everyone is so proactive in there. Like the, you know, the people who, I wouldn't say organizers, but like the people who mod, you know, like that space are really just really excellent, and it's really nice to have that space that encourages people to actually make things and share them. And I guess that probably is what like you mean by like, you know, like wanting a goal, you know, like that sort of like, it is like a low stakes nice goal, but I think that is a good push to make people make things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the analogy like I drew on in like Voiceworks and Voiceworks Online is like how next week for Emerging Writers Festival, we'll be publishing our first online issue, which is like a, you know, we're publishing like a series of works all throughout the same week, as opposed to sort of publishing them as soon as they're ready last year. And up until now, we've had this kind of continuous call out period for work and publishing, you know, at any time. And some of the difficulties there kind of come from like, if there isn't a deadline, what are you sort of working towards? And we've felt like, I think it's been seen across like, you know, you know, us getting maybe less submissions than the magazine, where there is like a consistent theme and call out period, like deadline for work. And also on the editorial side, where like we're making decisions around how a piece develops, and then sort of like, when do you say, like, okay, like we can't keep sort of back and forthing on this piece, like there has to be an end publishing point, which I feel like I feel like, Cecile, when we were working on Endless Scroll, I was quite bad at like letting that sort of just drift on for a long time. So I'm quite glad to move to that sort of model, and I think it can be a good motivator. Even just like you said, with the jams having like a set theme and having like issues where, you know, there's like a theme that you can like sort of be working towards is really interesting.
Yeah, it's really good. And like there's consistently been like really, really good work like that comes out of those things, and like it's always exciting. Like I don't take part of every like game jam, like I only do it maybe like once or twice every year, but like every time I do it I'm like, this is fun, you know, like and I think it is a good way for anyone from, you know, like beginners to like people who are super experienced and want to try something, you know, fun for a change. You know, like anyone can do it, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Cecile, I wanted to ask about, because you've been talking about the Bitsy community. I wanted to sort of ask about your experiences with sort of lit spaces, because I guess last year you came to NY, the National Young Writers Festival, to deliver a workshop on using Bitsy, and I don't know, just kind of interested to hear about your experiences going to that, and talking with writers about making games, I guess, as opposed to talking with I don't know. It feels so arbitrary. I keep talking about game makers and writers, and I just I cringe when I say it.
It makes sense. Like, the Young Writers Festivals was really. I went in 2018, I believe, and it was such a good experience, because I think it's like I would consider it to be like the equivalent of Freeplay in literature, where like it's very chill and it has this vibe of like inclusivity and like very like low key and just supportive in general. I think I really enjoyed being there, even though I was like technically an outsider. I never really felt like I was like out of touch, like, because I feel like everyone who was there, like speaker and attendees alike, were very just very open and interested, and a lot of people showed up for the Bitsy workshop, and all these people were like, never made a game before, and I find that very refreshing, in the sense that like, when you work in one field for a long time, you end up having these habits and like these how do you say, like these like expectations, I guess, that like someone who is new to it wouldn't have them, and would have this completely different kind of like outlook on it, and I feel like, and this kind of also like relates to how I work as a graphic designer, where like I'm like, most of my inspiration doesn't come from graphic design, it comes from elsewhere, and because I'm kind of purposefully having that attitude where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna not be inspired by the same field, because otherwise it kind of becomes boring. Like it kind of becomes very like self-referencing, which I don't really like, and so like I feel like being at the Young Writers Festival was very fun, and like I don't know, it was just like a really, really positive experience for me, just meeting a whole lot of like people, interesting people, and sharing, like our passions and like, like what we like, and like all these things. Like it was such a good experience. It was great.
I love NYWF, and I'm glad that you had a really nice time there as well. I want to circle back to what you were saying about sort of whether people have a sort of expectation about what is sort of can be made in like with games. And I think I it's something I think about with digital lit, and trying to encourage people to, like writers, to try and make something that is digital, is balancing that like idea of expectations, where like it's part of what makes, I think, making something that is digital or interactive or electronic or whatever is kind of scary, is that like because it's quite new, there aren't a lot of expectations, but also like it's helpful to give people like a sort of like, oh, well, these are the sorts of things that you could be making with Twine or with Tracery, with Padlet or whatever. But like also like, don't let that be the sort of, don't let that fence your creativity off, and balancing that out. What do you all think about like, I don't know, what do you all think about like expectations in terms of art form, like different forms of stories? Can they be like useful, or like are they like mostly, yeah? Am I making sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. And I've been thinking a lot about that lately, just like expectation, not so much in terms of the format of what it is you're producing, but what you can implement into it. And I feel like when you haven't created a certain kind of lit or engaged with a certain kind of creative software before, you don't really think about what you're putting into it. And I feel like it was me starting putting works on screen that made me think about illustrations that go along with it. Before that, I was like, writing is writing and it's nothing else. But then as soon as I had no expectation of the format, I could branch out into other things to look at other than words. And having the two work side by side was something completely new to me, even though it's very basic. Like, why hadn't I thought of it before?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, but I think that also, I've had that experience in just lit, like not even digital, but thinking about like coming into poetry, or like I remember I took one creative writing class at uni, and it was like a fiction class, and I just loathed it. Like I really bounced off of the like lecturers kind of like very like, oh, you know, here are the things that you can do in the first sentence of a story, and here are things you can't do, and like comparing that to like a lot of the work that I was really into at the time, just being like, none of these rules are like, where, like I don't see these rules anywhere now. Like they kind of work as this sort of, I don't know, creative straitjacket.
Yeah. No, like I wanted to be like, how weird is it that my most conventional writing was done at uni? But I'm like, no, that's expected. Like that makes so much sense.
And I kind of love, like I want to kind of mention Carly's writing, which I was reading today, your piece in Go Down Swinging, Mincing, and then also in Goth, the sort of tables of subject, object, verb. And it's so interesting. And like, I just love this kind of like very visual sort of use of words that I remember when I first read Goth. I was just like, the piece in Goth, which was a previous issue of Voiceworks, I should flag. Oh, I've got a copy here. It's just like, it would blew my mind, you know? How do you feel about, like, I guess, expectations around like the way writing works and storytelling works, and kind of playing with that? I don't know if it's weird for me to like showcase this, but like, just I love these, like,
So cool.
Oh,
so good.
Yeah, I guess now that I think about it, I think a lot of that the subject object tables probably came out of a bit of resentment for the rigidity of university writing, creative writing courses, like this kind of really rigid, regimented way of kind of dividing up the piece and what should happen when, and how a sentence should look, and like how to be experimental, like here are the rules for experimenting, which is just exhausting. Like it's totally bizarre. And it's interesting how Rory, you mentioned we've been talking about like what it's like to impose these boundaries onto digital lit when they don't need to be there, like setting a deadline for submissions, that kind of thing. But those boundaries are so arbitrarily enforced in the way that people talk about print literature as well. So I think that, yeah, there's a lot of expectations as to how print writing needs to look, and how nonfiction needs to look, and how it needs to feel, and like the way things need to be divided up, and what makes good nonfiction. And I think that there's a lot of sort of power in there as well. I think it really reinforces like a lot of different expectations as to like who should be writing nonfiction, especially, and like and yeah, I think it can be quite reductive and very limiting. But when you experiment, whether that's in print, when you're experimenting with form or structure, or if you're experimenting by making it digital, I think you kind of get to bypass a lot of that power, and bypass a lot of the systems that enforce these really arbitrary boundaries, and kind of get a bit closer to the immediate experience that you're trying to represent through your literature. So yeah, I'm really excited about experimental forms, and I feel like it feels really new as well. I can't really think of that many really old experimental writers. So yeah, experimental literature and digital literature are two really exciting scenes at the moment.
I feel like it's interesting too, thinking about, I've noticed in Carly's work that their use of language, and I feel like this is mirrored by the fact that you're just in digital spaces, that the way that you write, not just formally, but also just like the language you're using and the vocab you're using, has also gotten a lot more ruthless and experimental, because there's like this greater unpacking of boundaries that takes place. And it's like, once you've unpacked one, then all the others start to break down as well. And you lose all sense of like, this is what I've got to be doing at all times.
And that's so funny, because that's something that I see in your work. But yeah, there's something that happens when I think there's like one moment, I'm not sure if you guys can name your moment, but I'm sure it's happened to you, where you feel like, hang on a second, I can write whatever I want. In that moment, everything slowly starts to buckle and collapse, which I think can be really rewarding to get to see other people's writing progress in that way.
Yeah, I there's a question I want to ask, like very quick towards the end, but you mentioned that moment, and I just want to flag like going to a subbed-in reading, which is this like reading event in Sydney, and seeing Dan Hogan read a poem just completely like it was like a hard reset on like everything that I thought about poetry up until that point and writing up until that point. And it was like so good. Like I still point to that and be like, yes, this is where like so much of my approach has sort of been rebuilt from that particular moment. But I wanted to ask, we're kind of getting to the end, explicitly this question that we've sort of been tiptoeing around most of the panel, which is what advice would you give to game makers interested in writing and bringing storytelling into their work? And then I guess also the other side of that is like tips for writers interested in telling stories through games. I guess we've kind of talked about that with you know, about getting involved and game jams and the opportunities there. But I don't know if we've kind of mentioned much about game makers interested in writing. Where do you think would be a good place to, where's the start here of writing stories? Probably
reading stories.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like, I was thinking about my own experiences, but like, for a long time, I actually didn't really like literature. Like, I went to French school, and French literature is really dusty. And I just never really enjoyed that. Like, it just made me feel dumb, like being in class, like in high school, and like, you know, like reading these like old ass like things and being like, oh, like, I don't know, what am I supposed to get here? And like, I just felt really like not good about it. And like for the longest time, I just kind of like avoided that stuff. And the only time that I felt a little bit excited by like the whole prospect of like studying like that kind of like literature was like when I actually like got introduced to like experimental stuff, like weirder like things, and I'm like, oh, you can do that with words, that's interesting, they never taught that like in school. And I'm like, and like it just like changed everything. And in the sense that I was like, oh, it's not that I'm like stupid, it's just that like it, like none of the old stuff is for me. Like it's so funny, but like yeah, like it's like that. And like kind of like getting excited about like different kinds of like writing and reading more. Like I think that's probably like a good way to get started. It's like, what kind of writing do you like? And figuring that out, and then like starting to make something from that. Like I think like also like a lot of the writing that I like, you know, made me fall in love with the whole concept of that was also like reading comics, which is like in part very much like reliant on good writing. So like that was kind of like my transition from like a literature hating goblin to a literature writing goblin. So yeah.
I love that so much. Carly, Lujayn, have you got any advice, I guess, for game? I mean, it's not necessarily just for game makers, but it could just be people kind of interested in writing, creative writing.
I think I think we've sort of talked about this in meetings and that kind of thing, Rory. Like there's not that many game makers and writers that are really actively working together. I think I'd really love to see more game makers reach out explicitly to writers for collaborations. I think that's a really exciting prospect. But also I feel really excited about game makers getting into writing for the first time. And I think, yeah, like you said, Cecile, just starting to read, not like dusty old things, or not what you think literature should be, but just getting into like looking at the journals that you want to contribute to and just seeing what they're doing and looking at all the different possibilities there are. Because really, yeah, I think when before you start reading, like it can feel really daunting, and it can feel like there's a lot of really rigid definitions for like what good literature should be. But I think once you get into it, it's like, oh, there's actually people are just messing around.
Yeah. And like technically to that, I feel like my advice would be that you don't have, and this is actually, maybe this is blasphemy, but like you don't have to be accurate at all in what you're writing. Like you can write a whole pile of bullshit that like doesn't make any sense at all, and that like, and you're calling it nonfiction, but it's not nonfiction. I'm not saying spread fake news. That's like, I feel like I'm giving a really bad message.
I think you can nonsense.
Just like, right, make nonsense, and like that's fun, and I feel like it goes really well with games to make nonsense. Like it's the most forgiving format, in my opinion.
Yeah, it makes me think of like stories about like I don't know, like it's maybe an outdated discussion, but like things like Journey, or like, I don't know, like Gone Home, or like, you know, games that are kind of pushing or going against what is maybe thought of in the mainstream as a game, and people being like, oh, well, you can't call that a game, and you know, it's kind of like, well, who cares? I feel like that also carries across like to writing so much. And Carly, I really like what you said about having game makers and writers collaborate more. I think that's also a really good point, that like, you know, you don't have to do this alone. And like, I think making anything creative, whether it's a story or an essay or a game, is more fun when you're doing it with somebody else. That's what I really kind of value about publications that have a sort of intensive editorial process, is that it is kind of inviting somebody to work on your piece with you. And I'm really grateful for all the times I've been edited in like really thoughtful ways, because it's expanded my writing way beyond what I thought it could be, I guess.
Yeah, and I feel like coming back to collaboration, I feel like because the stakes with digital writing are so low, and you can just like write whatever you want to write, and you're asked to have fun. It's a lot easier to have fun when you're doing it with someone else. Like I feel like the only digital pieces I've ever written have been collaborative, or the only collaborative pieces I've ever written have been digital. Like, yeah. Because I don't feel like there are any stakes, and it's not just like, it's meant to be a story to share as opposed to just making it my narrative.
It's meant to be fun and interactive.
Right,
It
exactly.
sucks to sit there working on your solo piece and being like, is this fun?
Yeah, yeah. Like, is this joke landing? And I don't know, because I'm not reading it to anyone.
I was just thinking about just reading your piece earlier with like the "Are you insulting corn?" sorry, I'm not Cornish. Stuck with me the rest of the afternoon. That landed. I loved it. And also, I guess, Carly, what you're saying about like, you know, I'm not sure about this. Is this fun? Does this work? Like a bit of a call out and promo, you know, if you are making writing or you're making a game and you're under 25 and in Australia, you should submit to Voiceworks Online. We give feedback on every submission. We pay for published pieces, and you'll get to, you know, edit your work with one of the editors on our editorial team. And it's a really fun, good process. I hope. Cecile, hopefully back me up there.
Yes, it is. I'll just say one last, like, I think like being edited is honestly a very vulnerable process, because like you're kind of like presenting this like really raw version of you and or like you and your work, and that is very like kind of intimidating. And I was like, the first time I did it, I was like, my first draft, I was like, oh my God, what if it's bad? But the role of an editor is never to like demean you and tell you like, oh, you're shit, like, because the reason they're editing you in the first place is because you're good. Like,
exactly.
So like I feel like that, like learning to be more vulnerable and more comfortable with like being, you know, okay with that kind of like receiving feedback and stuff is a very important step of like being like an artist. And like I feel like that like making Endless Scroll with your support, Rory, was like a turning point for me. Like it just like really made me feel like, oh, okay, this is real now. Like I'm in the zone now. And yeah, that was really good. So like everyone should also submit to Voiceworks.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. Thanks, Cecile. I think that we're kind of pushing for time. We'll probably wrap up. Thanks so much for joining us on this panel. If you want to find out more about Voiceworks and Voiceworks Online, you can find us at voiceworksmag.com.au or follow us on social media. Thank you so much, Cecile. Thank you so much, Carly, Lujayn. You're all the best.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
That's all right. We hope you can stick around because up next we are presenting a reading of writers, including everybody from this panel. I didn't realize that until now, despite helping put it together. Making things that you play, thinking about play, and using the written form playfully. The link to the reading is in the YouTube chat, right now. So you can click on that and go to that. Otherwise, I'll see you all later. Have a great rest of Freeplay. Stay safe and well.
Bye.
Bye.